A millionaire gave $400 to a homeless woman. The next day, he found her at his wife's grave. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heart-touching tales like this. Enjoy the journey. It was a cold, unforgiving autumn evening in the heart of New York City. The streets buzzed with their usual chaos. Yellow taxis honking impatiently, streetlights flickering in the growing darkness, and a cacophony of hurried footsteps as people rushed to escape the biting chill. The city seemed alive, a relentless machine that never paused, never cared, always moved forward. Among the chaos, a man stood still, a tall, composed figure dressed in a tailored overcoat and polished leather shoes. Richard Whitmore, a name synonymous with wealth and success, surveyed the bustling crowd with a detached gaze. To most, he was an untouchable figure, the epitome of the American dream. But tonight, even he couldn't escape the weight pressing on his chest. His visits to Greenwood Memorial Cemetery had become routine since Eleanor, his beloved wife, had passed 3 years ago. Despite his fortune, despite the countless accolades lining his office walls, Richard couldn't fill the void her absence had left. He turned down a quieter side street, intending to grab a coffee before heading home. That's when he saw her, a frail woman huddled against the wall of a coffee shop, her figure barely visible under layers of tattered clothing. A piece of cardboard rested on her lap, the scrawled words shaky but clear. Hungry and cold. Anything helps. Richard hesitated, his polished shoes halting just shy of a puddle. He wasn't unfamiliar with the sight of homelessness. No one in New York City was. Usually, he would walk past, offering nothing more than a fleeting glance. But tonight felt different. Perhaps it was the weight of Eleanor's absence or the fatigue from a day filled with hollow conversations. Whatever it was, he found himself rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The woman's head was bowed, her thin fingers clutching the edges of her sign as if bracing against a world's indifference. A sudden gust of wind sent a shiver through her frail frame, and she pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her shoulders. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it slowly, revealing several crisp $100 bills. Without a word, he stepped forward and extended 4 of them toward her. "Here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Get yourself something warm." The woman looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. They were startlingly clear, eyes that seemed to carry stories too heavy for one lifetime. For a moment, she didn't move, as if the sight of the money had paralyzed her. Then, with trembling hands, she reached out and took the bills. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracked and barely audible. "Bless you." Richard nodded curtly, already turning to leave. He wasn't one for lingering or indulging in the gratitude strangers. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about her. It gnawed at him, an unease he couldn't quite place. The night air grew colder as he made his way home, but the image of the woman stayed with him. Her weary face, her trembling hands, the quiet dignity in her eyes. It all felt too close, too personal. He told himself to let it go. After all, what did it matter? He had done his part, hadn't he? The next morning, Richard followed his usual routine. After a quick breakfast in his sprawling but empty penthouse, he drove to Greenwood Memorial Cemetery. The long, winding path to Eleanor's grave was lined with towering oaks whose leaves had turned shades of gold and crimson. It was a quiet place, far removed from the noise of the city, a place where Richard could find solace, or at least try to. He parked his car and stepped out, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his feet the only sound. As he approached Eleanor's headstone, he saw something that stopped him cold. A figure was kneeling by the grave, her head bowed and hands clasped as if in prayer. For a moment, Richard thought he was imagining it, but as he drew closer, recognition hit him like a tidal wave. It was her, the homeless woman from last night. His breath caught in his throat. What was she doing here? How did she even know Eleanor? The woman seemed to sense his presence and looked up, her face pale with alarm. She scrambled to her feet, clutching her worn coat as if it could shield her from his scrutiny. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to intrude." Richard's mind raced, questions swirling in his head. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone sharper than he intended. The woman hesitated, her gaze darting between him and the headstone. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "I knew her, Eleanor. She saved my life." The words hit Richard like a thunderclap. His wife is Eleanor. What was this woman talking about? How could Eleanor, who had spent her days hosting charity galas and managing their household, have saved a homeless woman's life without him knowing? "What do you mean she saved your life?" he asked, his voice low, but filled with urgency. The woman looked away, her eyes brimming with tears. "I can't explain it now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's true. She was an angel to me." Before Richard could press her further, she turned and began to walk away, her steps hurried and unsteady. "Wait," he called after her, but she didn't stop. He stood there, rooted to the ground, staring after her as she disappeared down the cemetery path. His gaze shifted back to Eleanor's grave, his mind reeling. What had his wife done, and why had she kept it from him? As Richard left the cemetery that day, he felt a new determination rising within him. Whoever this woman was, whatever her connection to Eleanor, he needed to know the truth. Richard couldn't get the woman's words out of his mind. "She saved my life." The phrase echoed through him like a haunting melody, growing louder with each passing moment. Eleanor, his Eleanor, had been everything to him, a beacon of grace and kindness in his world of high-stakes business and cold transactions. But now, he realized there was an entire side of her life he had never known, and it was connected to a homeless woman he had met by sheer chance. The next morning, Richard found himself pacing the polished floors of his penthouse, his thoughts tangled in frustration and curiosity. He couldn't focus on work. Emails went unanswered, calls ignored. The world he had meticulously built over decades suddenly seemed insignificant in the face of this mystery. By midday, his resolve hardened. He couldn't let this go. He had to find her, the woman at the grave. He had to understand what she meant, what Eleanor had done, and why she had never spoken of it. Grabbing his coat, Richard left his penthouse and headed back to the one place he thought she might return to. The streets were colder than the day before, the wind biting against his face as he walked toward the coffee shop where he'd first seen her. The city moved around him in its usual rhythm, oblivious to the turmoil within him. He scanned the area, but saw no sign of her. For a moment, he wondered if he had been foolish to think she'd be here again. But just as doubt began to creep in, a familiar figure emerged from an alleyway, her thin frame hunched against the cold. It was her. Richard quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing against the pavement. "Wait," he called out. The woman turned sharply, her expression wary as her eyes locked onto his. She clutched her coat tightly, as though bracing herself for confrontation. "You again," she said softly, her voice a mix of caution and disbelief. "Why are you following me?" "I need answers," Richard said firmly. "What did you mean when you said Eleanor saved your life?" "I need to know." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting toward the alley as if contemplating an escape. But then, something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even trust. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Fine," she said, "but not here. Follow me." Richard followed her through a maze of narrow streets and alleyways, the noise of the city fading with each step. Finally, they arrived at a rundown shelter on the edge of the neighborhood. The sign above the door read Grace Haven, the paint peeling and letters barely legible. "This is where it all started," the woman said, pushing the door open. Inside, the shelter was a mix of warmth and weariness. The air smelled faintly of soup and old wood. Cots lined the walls, and a few residents sat at a communal table, sharing quiet conversations. Richard looked around, feeling out of place in his tailored coat and leather shoes. The woman led him to a corner where a small, weathered table stood. She gestured for him to sit, then lowered herself into the chair across from him. "My name is Martha," she began, her voice steadier now. "Eleanor found me 5 years ago. I was living on the streets, pregnant and desperate. I didn't think I'd survive another week." Richard's chest tightened as he listened, his mind racing. "Eleanor never told me about you," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Martha nodded. "She didn't want to burden you. She said she didn't want her kindness to become a trophy or something that defined your relationship. She just wanted to help." Martha's gaze drifted toward the shelter's entrance, as if she could still see Eleanor walking through the doors. "She brought me here, paid for everything, the medical bills, the food, even clothes for my baby. She sat with me when no one else would, listened to my fears, and told me I was stronger than I thought." Richard felt his throat tighten, a mix of admiration and sorrow swelling within him. "What happened to your baby?" he asked hesitantly. Martha looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "She didn't make it," she said, her voice breaking. "An infection. She was just a few weeks old. Eleanor was there the whole time. She held her, cried with me, and promised I wouldn't face the world alone." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of Martha's story hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the quiet battles Eleanor had fought without ever seeking recognition. "Why the grave?" Richard finally asked. "Why were you at her grave?" Martha hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edges of her coat. "I go there to thank her," she said simply, "for everything she did for me, for being the closest thing to family I've ever had." Richard leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. Eleanor's kindness had been boundless, but why had she kept it from him? Was she afraid he wouldn't understand? "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked aloud, more to himself than to Martha. "She didn't want you to feel like you'd failed her," Martha said quietly. "She thought it would hurt you to know how much she carried alone." The words cut deep, leaving Richard speechless. He looked around the shelter, at the people Eleanor had undoubtedly touched in ways he could never have imagined. As he stood to leave, Martha reached out and touched his arm. "There's someone else you should talk to," she said. "Pastor Williams. He runs this place." He knew Eleanor better than anyone. Richard nodded, his resolve hardening. He would find this Pastor Williams. He would uncover the full story of Eleanor's hidden life, no matter where it led him. That night, as Richard returned to his empty penthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was on the cusp of something monumental. Eleanor had left him a trail, one of secrets, sacrifice, and compassion, and he was determined to follow it to the end. The next morning, Richard rose with a sense of purpose. The encounter with Martha had left him shaken, but it also fueled a deep determination to uncover the truth about Eleanor. He had spent years thinking he knew her completely, but now he realized there were parts of her life he had never been privy to, parts she had deliberately kept hidden. As the city began to wake, Richard found himself standing in front of Grace Haven once again. This time, he wasn't just there to observe or question. He was there to listen. The shelter was quieter in the early hours, with most of the residents still asleep. A kind-faced man in his 60s, wearing a simple sweater and slacks, greeted him at the door. "You must be Richard Whitmore," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Pastor Williams. Martha told me you'd be coming." Richard shook his hand, feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "I need to know about Eleanor," he said, his voice steady. "Martha told me some things, but I need the whole story. What did she do here? And why didn't she tell me about it?" The pastor motioned for Richard to follow him into a small office at the back of the shelter. The room was modest, with mismatched furniture and walls lined with photographs of smiling faces, residents and volunteers who had passed through Grace Haven over the years. On the desk sat a thick folder labeled Eleanor Whitmore. "She left this with me," Pastor Williams said, sliding the folder across the desk. "She told me that if you ever came asking, it was yours to see." Richard stared at the folder, his heart pounding. It was as if Eleanor had anticipated this moment, as if she had known he would eventually seek out the truth. Slowly he opened it, revealing a collection of handwritten letters, photographs, and receipts. Each piece of paper told story, a life Eleanor had touched, a struggle she had helped ease. "She was one of our biggest supporters," Pastor Williams said, his voice filled with admiration. "But she didn't just write checks. She was here in the trenches, listening to people, comforting them, helping them find their way." Richard picked up a photograph of Eleanor standing with a group of residents outside the shelter. She was smiling, her arms wrapped around a young girl who couldn't have been older than 10. It was a side of her he had never seen, unfiltered, raw, and deeply connected to the world around her. "Why didn't she tell me?" Richard asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Pastor Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "She said she didn't want her work here to change how you saw her. She knew you lived in a world of deals and transactions, and she didn't want her compassion to feel like another line item on a ledger. She wanted it to be hers alone." Richard felt a pang of guilt. Had he really been so disconnected from the struggles of others that Eleanor had felt the need to shield him from this part of her life? "She was extraordinary," the pastor continued. "I've met a lot of people in my time, but Eleanor, she was different. She didn't just give money, she gave herself. She believed in the dignity of every person who walked through these doors." As Richard sifted through the contents of the folder, he came across a handwritten letter addressed to him. His breath caught as he unfolded it, recognizing Eleanor's elegant handwriting. "My dearest Richard, if you're reading this, it means you've found the part of my life I couldn't bring myself to share with you. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I loved you too much to burden you with it. You have always carried so much, Richard. Our business, our home, our dreams. I didn't want to add to that weight. This work, these people, they gave me something I could never explain. They showed me what it means to truly see someone, to be present in their pain and their joy. I hope you can understand why I kept this to myself. It wasn't out of secrecy, but out of love. If you're reading this, then maybe it's time for you to see the world through their eyes, as I did. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. I promise you that." The words blurred as tears filled Richard's eyes. He could hear Eleanor's voice in every sentence, feel her presence in every word. She had lived with a depth of compassion he could only aspire to, and now she was asking him to step into her world. Pastor Williams placed a gentle hand on Richard's shoulder. "She believed in you, Richard. She always did. That's why she left this for you, to help you find your way to the work she loved so much." Richard nodded, unable to speak. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. "What can I do?" he finally asked, his voice breaking. "How do I honor her legacy?" The pastor smiled. "Start by listening. Spend time with the people she cared for. Their stories will show you the way." That afternoon, Richard stayed at the shelter, sitting with residents and listening to their stories. There was Daniel, a former schoolteacher who had lost everything after an illness left him bankrupt. Rosa, a young mother who had fled an abusive home. Each story was a testament to resilience, a reminder of the humanity Eleanor had devoted herself to. As the sun began to set, Richard felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Eleanor's legacy wasn't just in the shelter or the people she had helped. It was in the belief that compassion could change the world. He left Grace Haven with the folder in hand and a newfound resolve. He couldn't bring Eleanor back, but he could carry her spirit forward. The sun was beginning to set as Richard sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights flickering to life below him. The folder from Grace Haven lay open on the coffee table in front of him, its contents carefully spread out like pieces of a puzzle he was desperately trying to solve. Eleanor's letter still sat in his hand, her words echoing in his mind, "See the world through their eyes." As much as the letter brought him closer to understanding her, it also left him with more questions. Why had she kept this hidden for so long? And why had she chosen to help these people, strangers who seemed to have no connection to their lives? One photograph in particular caught his attention. It was a black and white picture of Eleanor sitting on the steps of Grace Haven with Martha. They both looked younger, happier. Martha was pregnant, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly, and Eleanor sat beside her, an arm draped across her shoulder. The bond between them was undeniable. Richard stared at the image, a strange sense of unease creeping over him. He needed to know more. He had to understand the depth of Eleanor's relationship with this woman and why she had been such an integral part of her life. The next morning, Richard returned to Grace Haven. This time, he wasn't there to listen passively. He was there for answers. Martha was sitting outside the shelter, her thin frame hunched over as she sipped from a steaming mug. She looked up as Richard approached, her expression guarded. "You're back," she said softly, her voice laced with a mixture of surprise and resignation. "I need to talk to you," Richard said, taking a seat on the steps beside her. "There's more to the story, isn't there? More to your connection with Eleanor." Martha's hands tightened around her mug, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I already told you everything," she said after a long pause. "She saved my life. She gave me hope when I didn't have any." Richard shook his head. "That's not everything," he said firmly, holding up the photograph. This was more than just charity. You meant something to her. I can see it." Martha glanced at the photo, her eyes softening as a faint smile played on her lips. "That was taken a few weeks before my daughter was born," she said quietly. "Eleanor was there for me every step of the way. She wasn't just helping me. She was my friend." Richard leaned closer, his voice gentle but insistent. "Why didn't she tell me about you? About your baby? What was she hiding?" Martha hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "She wasn't hiding anything," she said finally. "She just didn't want you to feel burdened by her choices. She knew how much you carried already, and she didn't want to add to it." Richard frowned, his frustration mounting. "That doesn't explain why you were at her grave," he said, "or why she kept this part of her life completely separate from me." Martha sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the conversation was too much to bear. "You want the truth?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Richard said firmly. "I need the truth." Martha set her mug down and folded her hands in her lap. "Eleanor didn't just save me. She saved my daughter too. When I was too sick to care for her, Eleanor stepped in. She named her, held her, loved her like she was her own." Richard's breath caught in his throat. The image of Eleanor cradling a newborn, her face filled with love and hope, flashed through his mind. "What happened to her?" he asked, his voice trembling. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "She didn't make it," she said, her voice breaking. "An infection took her before she even had a chance to live." Eleanor was devastated. She cried with me, held me through the worst of it. And after, she visited her grave every year, even when I couldn't bring myself to go. Richard felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. Eleanor had carried this pain, this heartbreak, all on her own. And she had done it out of love, shielding him from a grief she thought would overwhelm him. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Martha looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. "Because she loved you, Richard. She didn't want you to feel like you had failed her or anyone else. She wanted to protect you, even if it meant carrying the burden alone." As they sat in silence, Richard felt a wave of emotions crashing over him. Grief, guilt, admiration. Eleanor had been so much more than he had ever realized. She had been a woman of incredible strength and compassion, someone who had given everything to those in need without asking for anything in return. Martha reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "She asked me to give you this," she said, handing it to him, "but only when I thought you were ready." Richard took the envelope, his hands trembling as he opened it. Inside was another letter from Eleanor. "My dearest Richard, if you're reading this, then you've already discovered a part of my life I kept hidden. I'm sorry if it hurt you, but I hope you understand why I did it. I didn't want you to feel like you had to carry my burdens. I wanted to protect you, just as you always protected me. The time I spent at Grace Haven was the most meaningful of my life. It reminded me of the goodness in people, even in the darkest of times. It gave me hope, even when the world seemed so cruel. And it gave me you, Richard, the strength to keep going, the love to believe in something greater. Please don't be angry with me. Instead, I ask you to carry on what we started together. The people I met, the lives we touched, they need someone to believe in them. You can be that person, Richard. I know you can." Tears streamed down Richard's face as he folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. For the first time in years, he felt truly connected to Eleanor, not just as her husband, but as someone who understood the depth of her heart. He stood and turned to Martha, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Martha nodded, a faint smile on her lips. She believed in you, Richard. Now it's your turn to believe in yourself. That night, as Richard walked through the city streets, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. Eleanor's legacy was more than a memory. It was a call to action. And for the first time, he was ready to answer it. Richard spent the next few days in a whirlwind of reflection and determination. The letter Eleanor had left him, with its poignant words and heartfelt plea, played over and over in his mind. "Carry on what we started together." Those words felt heavier with each passing moment, not as a burden, but as a purpose. He found himself back at Grace Haven almost instinctively. The shelter, once just another anonymous building in the sprawling city, now felt like a living, breathing part of Eleanor's memory. The residents and staff greeted him with a mix of curiosity and warmth, but Richard still felt like an outsider in their world. Pastor Williams approached him with a warm smile, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Back so soon?" he asked. Richard nodded. "I've been thinking about what Eleanor wrote," he said, "about carrying on her work. I want to do more. I don't just want to honor her. I want to understand her." The pastor's eyes softened. "That's a noble goal, Richard. But this work, it's not just about opening your wallet. It's about opening your heart. Are you ready for that?" "I don't know," Richard admitted, "but I have to try." Pastor Williams nodded approvingly. "Then let's get you started." The first thing Richard noticed about working at Grace Haven was how raw and unfiltered the experience was. There was no boardroom polish, no carefully curated narratives, just people, each with a story that seemed both uniquely their own and universally heartbreaking. One of the first residents he met was Daniel, a man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that carried a shadow of pain. Once a high school teacher, Daniel had lost everything after a cancer diagnosis drained his savings and cost him his job. As Richard listened to Daniel's story, he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. This wasn't a tale of bad decisions or reckless behavior. It was a reminder of how fragile life could be, even for someone who had done everything right. "You're Eleanor's husband, aren't you?" Daniel asked one afternoon, his voice soft but steady. Richard nodded. "I am." "She was incredible," Daniel said, his expression brightening. "She used to sit with me for hours, just talking. She didn't treat me like a project or a problem to solve. She treated me like a person." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. "What did she talk about?" he asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Everything. Life, love, her dreams for this place. She wanted it to be more than a shelter, She wanted it to feel like home. The words stayed with Richard as he spent the rest of the day helping to serve meals. The simple act of handing someone a plate of food felt profound in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the nourishment. It was about the acknowledgement, the small but powerful gesture of saying, "I see you." By the end of the week, Richard was exhausted but fulfilled. He had spent hours cleaning, organizing donations, and listening to stories from residents like Rosa, a young mother who had fled an abusive relationship, and Samuel, a teenager trying to find his footing after years in the foster care system. Each story added another layer to his understanding of Eleanor's work. It wasn't just about providing material support. It was about creating a space where people could feel safe, valued, and loved. One evening, as Richard was preparing to leave, Martha approached him. Her expression was softer than it had been in their earlier encounters, her guarded demeanor giving way to something closer to respect. "You're really doing it," she said, leaning against the doorway. "I didn't think you had it in you." Richard chuckled, the sound tinged with self-deprecation. "Neither did I," he admitted. Martha tilted her head, studying him. "You know, Eleanor used to say that the hardest thing about kindness is believing you deserve it yourself. She saw something in you, Richard, something she knew you'd find eventually." Richard's gaze dropped to the floor, her words both comforting and challenging. "I just wish she'd told me sooner," he said. Martha nodded. She had her reasons. "But you're here now, and that's what matters." She handed him a small, worn notebook. "This was hers," she said. "She used to write down her ideas for the shelter, things she wanted to do, changes she wanted to make. Maybe it'll help you figure out your next steps." Richard opened the notebook carefully, the pages filled with Eleanor's familiar handwriting. Each note was a glimpse into her mind. Plans for expanding the shelter, ideas for workshops to help residents find jobs, even recipes for meals she thought would bring comfort. "She thought of everything," Richard murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "She did," Martha said, "but she couldn't do it all alone." That night, Richard sat in his study, the notebook and folder spread out before him. He read through Eleanor's notes, her dreams for Grace Haven coming to life in his mind. One entry in particular stood out. "I dream of a network of shelters, all connected, all offering more than just a place to sleep. Education, support, love, that's what people need. That's what changes lives." The idea was bold, ambitious, and overwhelming. But as Richard stared at the words, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The next morning, he called Pastor Williams. "I want to expand Grace Haven," he said, his voice steady. "Not just the shelter, but more like it. I want to make Eleanor's dream a reality." The pastor was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's a big undertaking, Richard. Are you sure you're ready for it?" "I'm not sure of anything," Richard admitted. "But I know I can't let her legacy end here." Over the next few weeks, Richard threw himself into the project. He met with architects, donors, and community leaders, each step bringing him closer to Eleanor's vision. The work was challenging, often frustrating, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since losing her. And through it all, he felt her presence, guiding him, encouraging him, reminding him that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples that changed lives. One evening, as he stood outside Grace Haven watching the residents gather for a meal, Richard felt a deep sense of peace. Eleanor had given him a gift, one that went far beyond their years together. She had shown him the power of compassion, and now it was his turn to pass it on. The days began to blur together as Richard dedicated himself fully to Eleanor's vision. His mornings started early, often before the sun had risen, with meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions to expand Grace Haven. His nights ended late, poring over Eleanor's notebook and the letters from residents who had been touched by her kindness. Each story reminded him of the lives she had changed and the immense responsibility he now carried. But the work wasn't easy. For every step forward, there seemed to be a new obstacle, Zoning laws, funding shortfalls, and the constant battle to convince people that this mission was worth investing in. Richard had faced challenges before. He'd built his empire from nothing. Yet, this was different. This wasn't just business. This was personal. One afternoon, Richard found himself back at the shelter, helping to unload a delivery of donated goods. His tailored coat and polished shoes were a stark contrast to the rugged, everyday clothing of the staff, but he didn't care about appearances anymore. As he carried a box of canned goods inside, he overheard two residents talking in hushed tones. "Do you think he's serious about all this?" one of them asked. "Seems like it," the other replied. "But rich guys like him don't usually stick around. They come in, throw some money at the problem, and then disappear." The words stung more than Richard cared to admit. He knew they had every reason to doubt him. After all, how could someone like him, a man who had lived in a penthouse and dined in Michelin-starred restaurants, truly understand the struggles of those who walked through Gracehaven's doors? That evening, as the shelter began to quiet down, Richard sat in the common room with Pastor Williams. The two men shared a pot of coffee, the warm aroma filling the space. "I heard what some of the residents were saying," Richard admitted, staring into his cup. "They don't think I'm serious about this." The pastor chuckled softly. "Can you blame them? People like you don't usually step into places like this. And when they do, it's often for show." Richard nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I want to prove them wrong, but I don't know how. No matter what I do, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface." Pastor Williams leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Eleanor didn't win people over with grand gestures, Richard. She won them over with her presence. She showed up day after day and listened. That's what people need more than anything, to feel seen and heard." Taking the pastor's words to heart, Richard began spending more time with the residents. He sat with them during meals, joined them for workshops, and even participated in the weekly cleaning schedule. The more time he spent with them, the more he realized how much he had to learn. One evening, he found himself sitting with Rosa, the young mother who had fled an abusive home. She was helping her daughter, a bright-eyed 6-year-old named Lila, color in a picture of a house. "That's beautiful," Richard said, nodding toward the drawing. "Lila's been dreaming about having a real house someday," Rosa said with a small smile. "Someplace safe, where we can start over." Richard felt a pang in his chest. "You will," he said, his voice firm. "I'll do everything I can to help make that happen." Rosa looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and skepticism. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. Richard hesitated, the question catching him off guard. "Because I should have cared sooner," he admitted. "Eleanor saw what I couldn't. She understood what people needed in a way I never did. I'm trying to make up for lost time." Rosa nodded slowly, her expression softening. "She talked about you a lot, you know," she said. "She said you had a good heart, even if you didn't always show it." The words stayed with Richard long after their conversation ended. Eleanor had believed in him, even when he hadn't earned it. Now he was determined to live up to that belief. As the weeks passed, the expansion plans for Gracehaven began to take shape. Richard had secured funding for a second shelter in a neighboring borough, and plans for a third were already underway. The work was demanding, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, while reviewing blueprints in his office, Martha appeared in the doorway. She was holding a small envelope, her expression unreadable. "This came for you," she said, handing it to him. Richard opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. It was from Samuel, a young man who had aged out of the foster care system and had lived at Gracehaven for several months. "Mr. Whitmore, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for Gracehaven. When I first came here, I didn't think I'd ever find a place where I belonged. But this shelter, it gave me hope. It gave me a chance. And I know that's because of you. I also wanted to say thank you for Eleanor. I never got to meet her, but I feel like I know her through the people here. They talk about her like she was an angel, and from everything I've heard, she was." You're carrying on her work, and I think she'd be proud of you. Thank you for seeing us, for believing in us, and for giving us the chance to believe in ourselves." Richard set the letter down, his throat tight with emotion. Samuel's words were a reminder of why he was doing this, not just for Eleanor, but for every person who walked through Grace Haven's doors. That evening, as he stood outside the shelter watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Richard felt a deep sense of peace. The journey was far from over, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Eleanor had given him the greatest gift of all, a reason to care, a reason to hope, and a reason to believe that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the world. The sound of hammering filled the air as Richard stood at the site of the new shelter. It was a chilly morning, but the activity around him was electric. Construction workers moved purposefully, laying the foundation for what would soon become the second Grace Haven. The blueprints Eleanor had once sketched in her notebook were finally coming to life, and Richard couldn't help but feel a swell of pride and gratitude. This wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of everything Eleanor had stood for: hope, compassion, and the belief that everyone deserved a second chance. "Looks like things are really moving along," Pastor Williams said, joining Richard at the edge of the construction site. Richard nodded, his eyes scanning the bustling scene. "It's starting to feel real," he admitted. "For so long, I didn't know if I could actually pull this off." The pastor smiled. "You're doing more than pulling it off. You're making a difference." Later that afternoon, Richard returned to the original Grace Haven. The shelter was quieter than usual, many of the residents out attending job fairs and workshops that had become a cornerstone of the program. Richard made his way to the common room, where a few residents sat, talking in hushed tones. Among them was Samuel, the young man who had written the heartfelt letter a few weeks earlier. Samuel was sketching in a notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you working on?" Richard asked, pulling up a chair beside him. Samuel looked up, startled at first, but then smiled. "Just a project I've been working on," he said, turning the notebook around to show Richard. The page was filled with intricate drawings of people, residents, volunteers, and staff from Grace Haven. Each face was rendered with a level of detail that made them almost lifelike. "These are incredible," Richard said, genuinely impressed. "You've got real talent." Samuel shrugged, a faint blush creeping into his cheeks. "Thanks. I've been thinking about putting together a mural for the new shelter, something that shows what Grace Haven is all about." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. "Eleanor would have loved that," he said softly. Samuel's smile widened. "I hope so. She's the reason I'm still here, even though I never met her. Her story, it's inspired all of us." That evening, Richard joined the residents for dinner. He sat with Rosa and her daughter, Lila, who was proudly showing off a new backpack she had received at school. Across the room, Daniel was helping another resident practice his interview skills, offering tips and encouragement. It struck Richard how much the shelter had changed since he first walked through its doors. What had once been a place of despair now felt alive with possibility. And wasn't just the physical improvements, it was the people, their resilience, and the community they had built together. After dinner, Richard stood to address the room. The conversations quieted as everyone turned their attention to him. "I just wanted to say thank you," Richard began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Thank you for letting me be a part of this community. I came here thinking I was supposed to fix things, to solve problems. But the truth is, you've taught me more than I could ever hope to give back." There was a murmur of agreement, and Richard continued. "This isn't just Eleanor's legacy, it's all of ours. Together, we're building something that will last, something that will change lives for years to come. And I'm honored to be a part of it." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he belonged. A few days later, Richard received an unexpected call. It was from a woman named Clara, who introduced herself as one of Eleanor's former colleagues from her charity work. "I heard about what you're doing at Grace Haven," Clara said. "I wanted to reach out because Eleanor and I used to talk about this dream of hers, a network of shelters, all working together to provide not just housing but hope. She believed it could change the world." Richard felt a wave of emotion as Clara's words sank in. "That's exactly what we're trying to do," he said. "But there's still so much work ahead." "I'd like to help," Clara said. "I have connections with other organizations, people who'd want to support what you're doing. Eleanor inspired so many of us, and I think we can do something incredible in her honor." Richard thanked her, and after the call ended, he sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline. The vision Eleanor had carried in her heart was becoming a reality, one step at a time. The next morning, Richard returned to the construction site of the new shelter. This time, he brought Samuel with him, carrying the young man's sketches for the mural. As they walked through the site, Samuel's excitement was palpable. "This is going to be amazing," Samuel said, his eyes shining. "I can already see it." Richard smiled. "And it's only the beginning," he said. As they toured the site, Richard couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. Eleanor had planted the seeds, and now those seeds were blossoming into something far greater than he could have imagined. Later that day, as the sun began to set, Richard stood outside Grace Haven, watching the residents go about their evening routines. He thought of Eleanor, of her quiet strength and boundless compassion. "I hope I'm making you proud," he whispered, his voice carried away by the wind. In his heart, he felt the answer. Eleanor's legacy wasn't just in the shelters or the lives they touched. It was in the love and hope that continued to ripple outward, changing the world one person at a time. The day of the grand opening for the second Grace Haven shelter had finally arrived. The sky was a brilliant blue, the sun shining brightly as though blessing the occasion. Richard stood in front of the gleaming new building, his heart pounding as he took in the crowd that had gathered. Residents from the original shelter, local officials, volunteers, and members of the community had come together to celebrate this milestone, a dream Eleanor had sketched in her notebook, now brought to life. The building itself was a testament to her vision. Its design was welcoming and warm, with large windows that let in natural light and spaces thoughtfully arranged to foster a sense of community. A large mural adorned one of the walls inside, depicting scenes of resilience, hope, and kindness. It was Samuel's work, and it had already become a centerpiece of the shelter. Richard stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone as the crowd fell silent. His eyes scanned the faces before him, pausing briefly on familiar ones. Martha, Rosa, Daniel, Samuel. Each of them represented a story of survival, a testament to what Grace Haven stood for. "Thank you all for being here today," Richard began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "This building isn't just a shelter. It's a symbol of what's possible when we come together, when we see each other not as strangers, but as neighbors, as family." He paused, his gaze lifting to the sky for a moment as if searching for Eleanor's presence. "This journey began with my wife, Eleanor. She was the heart and soul of this mission long before I ever understood its importance. Her compassion, her strength, her unwavering belief in the goodness of people. It's what brought us here today." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, others wiping away tears. Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. But Eleanor didn't do this alone. She believed in the power of community, in the idea that every small act of kindness could create ripples that change lives. And that's what Grace Haven is about. It's not just a place to stay. It's a place to rebuild, to dream, to hope. He stepped back from the podium as the crowd erupted into applause. For a moment, he stood there, taking it all in. This wasn't just a celebration of the building. It was a celebration of the lives it would touch and the legacy it would carry forward. After the ceremony, Richard walked through the shelter, watching as residents and visitors explored the space. There was a sense of wonder in the air, a feeling of possibility that was almost tangible. Samuel approached him, a small notebook tucked under his arm. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice earnest, "for letting me be a part of this. It's more than I ever imagined." Richard placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You're the one who made it real," he said. "Eleanor would have been so proud of you." Samuel smiled, his eyes bright with emotion. "I hope so," he said. "She's the reason I'm here. The reason we're all here." Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin out, Richard found himself standing in front of the mural. The vibrant colors and intricate details told a story of hope and perseverance, a story that mirrored his own journey. Martha joined him, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, nodding toward the mural. Richard nodded, his gaze never leaving the artwork. "It's more than beautiful," he said. "It's a reminder of what's possible." Martha smiled faintly. "You've done something incredible here, Richard. Eleanor would be proud." Richard turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You were the one who made me see what she saw, the one who helped me understand." Martha shrugged, her eyes glistening. "We all carry a part of her, Richard. That's how her legacy lives on." That night, Richard returned to Greenwood Memorial Cemetery. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly above. He knelt by Eleanor's grave, the cool stone pressing against his palm. "We did it," he said softly, his voice breaking. "The shelter is open, and it's everything you dreamed it would be." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph, the one of Eleanor holding Martha's baby, her face radiant with love. He placed it gently at the base of the headstone, a silent tribute to her memory. "I finally understand now," he continued, "why you did what you did, why you carried so much on your own. It wasn't just about helping others. It was about showing them they mattered, that they were seen." A tear slipped down his cheek as he whispered, "I'll keep going, Eleanor. I'll carry this torch for as long as I can. For you, for them, for all the lives we can still change." In the months that followed, Grace Haven continued to grow. The new shelter became a beacon of hope in the community, offering not just a place to stay, but programs to help residents rebuild their lives. Job training, counseling, childcare, all of it designed to give people the tools they needed to thrive. And Richard wasn't done. He had already begun plans for a third shelter, working closely with Clara and other leaders in the nonprofit world to create a network that would reach even more people. But more than the shelters, it was the connections he built, the moments of understanding and compassion, that defined his journey. Sitting with residents, listening to their stories, sharing their laughter and their tears, those were the moments that brought him closer to Eleanor and to the person she had always believed he could be. One evening, as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, Richard looked out over the city. The lights stretched out before him, a tapestry of lives and stories intertwined. For so long, he had seen this view as a symbol of his success. Now, it was a reminder of how much work there was still to do. Eleanor's voice echoed in his mind, as clear as if she were standing beside him. "The hardest things in life are the most worthwhile." He smiled, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. Her story had ended, but her legacy was eternal. And now, it was his to carry forward. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Was it the discovery of Eleanor's legacy, Samuel's mural, or perhaps Richard's transformation? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.